Hello, good day. My name is Richard Byron Cox. I'm the UNCCD Capacity Building Officer, and welcome to Module 4 of the course Introduction to the UNCCD Process. Today, I want to talk to you about that process, and this lecture is divided into two parts. In this first part, I will speak to you about the process at the global level and the decision-making process. Now, as you know, the UNCCD has a supreme body called the COP, the COP. Outside of that, there are subsidiary bodies, the CRIC and the CST. Now, all three of these bodies are global bodies, in a sense. The COP is global because that's where all the parties come together, all 197 of them, and they have the authority to make final decisions. Secondly, the CRIC is global because all the parties have a right to participate in the CRIC, and so too the CST. So meetings of the CST, CRIC, and the COP are global meetings, and this is where the global process happens. There's also something called the SPI, which is a Science Policy Interface, and this is connected to, as you can imagine, the CST. And here as well, the SPI is more or less a global body that deals with the interconnection between science and policy, the Science Policy Interface. Now, apart from that, there's also something called the G77 and China, which is one of the negotiating blocks of the UNCCD. And there's also the European Union, and there's JUSCANS. Okay, so all of these are part and parcel of that global operation, that global mechanism that functions to help run the UNCCD process, to ensure that the UNCCD process operates at the global level. But all of that happens day to day, okay? And apart from the things I mentioned, we also have our cooperation with people like the FAO, the GEF, UNDP, UNEP, and so on and so forth. And all of this happens on a daily basis, right, at the global levels. So who supports this, and how does this function? Well, that's where the Secretariat comes in. We are the custodians, and therefore these daily operations, in one way or the other, we are there to support this. Without us, it wouldn't function, because you need a mechanism. So that is what the Secretariat does in terms of this global process and this global operation. Now, I just mentioned the Secretariat. There's one other piece of that global puzzle that you need to know, which is very important. There's something called the Liaison Office in New York. This is our office. It's part of the Secretariat. And its job is to interact with the General Assembly and all of the other stakeholders of the UNCCD process, which is basically the world, right, at that level, meaning at the General Assembly level. So it interacts with the group of African states. It interacts with the group of Latin America and the Caribbean, right? But this is our main office in New York that helps us to keep daily constant contact with the General Assembly of the United Nations. So now that you have seen the machinery from the COP right down to the liaison office, what does it do and how does it work? Well, basically all of that is important for one crucial element of the UNCCD, which is the decision-making process. Because everything has got to be decided. The parties come together, they work, they talk, and they make a decision. Without a decision, we, the Secretariat, does not have a mandate. And without a decision, nothing goes forward. Without an agreement, nothing goes forward. So how does all of this work? Well, the UNCCD decision-making process is a feature of the UNCCD itself. In other words, what do I mean? Well, the UNCCD is a bottom-up approach kind of a process. In other words, it comes from the ground upwards, not the other way around. And because that is the case, the decision-making process is first and foremost governed by reports from the country parties. As you know, the country parties are supposed to implement the convention. Now, after every 4 years, they make a report. In that report, they say concretely what they have done, what worked, what didn't work, and so on and so on. That report goes to the CRIC. And the CRIC considers it and make conclusions and recommendations. The same thing happens with the science process, okay? The country party, the scientists and the people working with science and that whole process considers all of the advice given to the COP. They make a report, and that report contains recommendations and conclusions. Okay? And this goes to the CST plenary. From the CST plenary and from the CRIC plenary, these conclusions and the recommendation then arrive at the COP. Okay? And the COP has got to consider them. But how does this work? Well, concretely speaking, the COP authorizes the plenary of the CRIC and the plenary of the CST to set up what are called negotiation groups. They are sometimes called ad hoc working group, contact group, friends of the chair. They have different names, right? But it is impossible for thousands of people to sit down in a room to negotiate X or Y policy under the CRIC or under the CST. So these smaller groups are set up. They're usually open-ended, meaning anybody can go in and be part of it. But each region, each of the 5 annexes, select specific people to negotiate on their behalf. Now, these people negotiate on a question of policy, on a question of science. It then comes back to the plenary of the CRIC, the plenary of the CST, or the plenary of the COW, which is the committee of the whole. Okay? And these conclusions and recommendations are then agreed upon there. After that, it then goes to the COP plenary, right? The COP plenary is where everybody must be and where they take decisions. So what you actually have, therefore, in the decision-making process in the UNCCD is this. Firstly, it begins with the reports. What the reports contain, what people have said, what countries have said, what worked, what didn't work. It then moves from there, it comes to the CRIC. The CRIC then considers it, right, and makes a report. That report is then considered by the COP. Okay? A negotiation group is set up under the CRIC, under the CST, under the COW, as might be relevant, and they come up with concrete texts for decisions. These concrete texts are then considered by the plenary of the COP, and a decision is made. The COP can do one of 3 things. It can accept the draft decisions as sent by the CRIC, the CST, and the COW. It can reject them, or it can modify them and say this is what we want. But that is the authority of the COP. And the COP is so important here because it's only when the COP decides it has been decided. It's only then it has force. Without the COP, it doesn't work. Now, there are some other things that you need to know which are very, very important as regards this whole process. The first is this, that the COP doesn't really vote, generally speaking. It is very rare that a decision is made by voting. What actually happens is something called consensus. In other words, the parties sit down and they hammer out an agreement, okay? And sometimes it might not be what X party wants or what Y party wants, but it is something that they can live with. And so therefore, they agree consensus-wise that, okay, let's accept this, rather than each party voting yes or no for a particular decision. This is not how it works. Generally speaking, in the UNCCD process, parties come to decisions and adopt decisions based on consensus. Now, that is an easy way and it's a workable way, and it has worked for the 25 years of the UNCCD, so I don't see it being changed. Finally, I'd like to remind you that all of this is done as part of the global process. The next lecture will deal with the sub-regional and regional process right down to the national process, because as I have said, it all begins from the bottom up. Until next time, my name is Richard Byron Cox. I do hope that you have enjoyed this lecture.